prophecy, and of course we could talk about the evidence for the resurrection. Now on the
of which there is none.
other side of the equation here is evil. The best argument against God is evil. But is evil really an argument against God? Turns out that no, evil is not an argument against God. You say, how so?
Yes,
Because
Frank.
objective evil presupposes objective good, and objective good presupposes a standard outside of ourselves that establishes what good is, and that standard we would call God's very nature. So evil is actually an argument for God, not an argument against God. Now you can ask, why is there so much evil, which we'll get into, but you...
Yeah, it is, I gotta say, it's rare to have such low expectations and still be disappointed. Frank just shot himself in the foot. He literally did. I'll explain why. So what he's doing now is defining evil as just that which doesn't conform to the nature of God. So notice that he said that the standard of what is objectively good is the nature of God. Now, of course, I've pointed out in the past why this is completely ridiculous, but let's take this at face value, like Frank wants his audience to do. If the nature of God is what is the standard of objectively good, and anything which doesn't conform with the nature of God is that which is evil, why do things exist that don't conform with the nature of God? I'll wrap it up in a nice tight little syllogism for you. An omnipotent being whose nature is entirely good, devoid of evil, or morally perfect, would create / instantiate a state of affairs that's morally perfect. Premise 2, the universe that we live in is not morally perfect. Conclusion, therefore an omnipotent God whose nature is morally perfect, it did not create our universe. It's that simple. It's really that simple. Frank can't argue that God has this particular nature of moral perfection and goodness, and then simultaneously argue that God doesn't have to act in accordance with that nature. That's so silly. When we say that something has the nature of X, what we mean by that is that X is a fundamental essential property of this thing, and that it can't be otherwise, right? So what would be a fundamental essential property of my lighter? Well, an essential property of my lighter is that it can ignite. It has the property of ignition, or the function of ignition, I should say. I don't know. That's a weird argument to make, but it's at the very least, it can ignite things. If it can't ignite things, then it's not a lighter by definition, right? So if God could ever act in a way that wasn't morally perfect, well, then he's not morally perfect by definition. Now, the only way that Frank can get out of this problem is to suggest that all the things that we observe as evil are actually good because they do, in fact, conform with the nature of God, which is what Calvinists do, because they recognize that this is a problem. You see, we could get into the Euthyphro dilemma, which Frank has horribly failed to address, but if I were to say something like honesty is a characteristic of the nature of God, is honesty good because it's a characteristic of the nature of God, or is the nature of God good because it's honest? All you do is push the Euthyphro dilemma back a step to establish the good nature of God. But in either instance here, right, let's say it's the first, that honesty is good because it's the nature of God. Well, then all you're saying is that things which conform with the nature of God are definitionally good, right? That's just what we mean when we say good, a thing which conforms to the nature of God, which removes it from any real-world connotations. And then things which don't conform to the nature of God are that which is evil. But it's logically impossible for things to exist which don't conform to the nature of God, because that would require that God has the power to create things that violate his own nature. And I wonder, what would Frank Turek's argument be if I were to ask him, can God create a stone so heavy he couldn't lift it? What would his argument in response to that be? I can tell you exactly what it would be. A thing which God can't lift is logically impossible, and logic is reflective of the nature of God, and God can't contradict his own nature. So somehow, God can't contradict his nature when it comes to creating things that violate the laws of logic, but he can contradict his nature when it comes to creating things that are evil. Amazing. Now, Frank might be tempted to say that God didn't create evil. Humans did with our free will. Again, our free will doesn't entail the natural evil that exists, like tornadoes, hurricanes, tsunamis, and the like. But the other problem with that is that God is also all-knowing. So he knows all future events with infallible certainty, and therefore knew that a consequence of giving humans free will would be evil. And so therefore God knowingly allowed evil to enter the world, because he knew that that was the only possible procession of events subsequent to him granting humans free will.